Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he might make a bodybuilding deck featuring cards like Outmuscle and Bulk Up. It's Matt Morgan.
Actually, speaking of heavy things, Joey, we have a parrot and it weighed 50 pounds. But unfortunately, it died today, and it was really upsetting at first. But honestly, it's a huge weight off my shoulders.
Okay, Matt, just me visualizing that is like cartoonishly terrifyingly huge. Actually, that's a big bird.
Absolutely. A lot of plumage, you might say.
Polly wants to crack my spine whenever she lands on my shoulder.
All right, well, you heard him there. He might also make a bodybuilding deck where he just creates a bunch of construct tokens, literally building bodies. It's Dana Roach.
For people like the three of us heading to MagicCon Chicago next month, a little PSA for you. The city of Chicago is no longer giving speeding tickets. Instead, to deter speeders, they're giving away Blackhawks tickets.
That's a hockey joke. I don't know anything else about that, though.
They are, I believe, the worst team in the NHL right now.
You've just riled up the comments so much. There are going to be a couple of fans out there who are just like, "Oh man, no, I can't with you, Dana. Not anymore. How dare you insult my team?"
If those hockey fans could read, they'd be very upset.
Yes.
There it is. There it is.
No. All right. Well, Matt, what is it that we're talking about in this episode here, man?
Well, I hope you're enjoying seeing our faces now, because we are going to have maybe one of the most data-heavy episodes we've ever done. We've done a lot of digging into the commanders over the past several years, and we have so many conclusions and just some observations that we're here to share with you all. So prepare for kind of the ultimate commander data dump.
Mm-hmm. We looked over some patterns of the top commanders of all time, things that have fallen off, things that have stayed strong, things that maybe made a comeback. There is a lot to get into because we're going over years of data and lots of very, very popular commanders and some that only had their moment in the sun for a brief amount of time. This is going to be big. Let's do some quick shout outs before we hop into this really meaty data heavy topic.
We are now proudly suited up as Knights of the Order of the Dragon Shield. Like a suit of armor, our decks are now protected by Dragon Shield sleeves. And when I first upgraded my decks from penny sleeves years ago, Dragon Shield were what I bought. And here, 68 years later, they're still making an excellent product in dozens and dozens of colors and designs. So come find us for a game at MagicCon Chicago next month, where our decks will be kept safe from any and all disasters by Dragon Shield. Dominate the field with Dragon Shield.
That's so amazing. And I'm really looking forward to this partnership with Dragon Shield. We got some fun stuff cooking.
And I get a whole new rhyme scheme to play off every single week.
I know, you really get to keep it up. I'm really excited for you. But another thing that I'm excited for is how you can just support the podcast in so many different ways, whether it's subscribing on YouTube, subscribing on your local podcast app. But if you'd like to, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have all sorts of patron levels as a way to just get yourself a little something back in exchange for supporting us financially. Whether you want to join our Discord community, there's so much going on there. We're always talking about various things, getting maybe some influences for potential topics in the future, all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including that patron shout out that everybody wants to be in the running for. So this week, we are going to give a very, very huge shout out to Monica Dryden, who dried up all of her tears because she's so happy about supporting us on EDHRECast's patron account.
Matt, that is one of the biggest stretches for silly patron jokes that I've heard, but honestly, I'm so game for it. That was terrific.
I mean, you say it's a stretch, but it worked. We're here talking and giggling, and Monica's at home just so happy about it.
Yeah, and Monica, this is a pretty big episode, so thank you so much. Just as big of a thank you right back to you. All right, dudes, let's get into our main topic here. We're covering a lot of stuff. We've taken a big interest in some of the history of the top commanders over time, and we've got a couple of heat maps that folks will be able to see to measure that popularity as it rises and as it wanes. And we're covering a bunch of stuff looking over these maps. You know, top commanders that have stayed strong. They've got like huge staying power and they've held those top positions. Some commanders that have maybe faded over time or are still kind of hanging in there in those top spots, but might be fading. But then also some flash in the pan commanders that were popular and then immediately dropped off. And a personal favorite of mine, some commanders that made a comeback. They fell out of top popularity, but then eventually they made a rise once again. How and why did they have a resurgence like that? There's so much here for us to cover. And frankly, I'm just so beyond excited to really start digging into this.
Huge thank you to Julia, our resident data scientist, who helped with all these visuals, because we have a lot of data that we like to sort through and trying to find ways that we can just display it better and help out all of the users of EDHREC, of Architect, all of our sites out there. And so Julia Madalena, she has been on staff with us for a while. We really got to pick her brain on a lot of these different questions. So if you're listening to this episode just on audio, you're doing yourself a huge disservice. Make sure you watch the YouTube, because there's so much visualization that she did an amazing job on. It's just going to help so much throughout this whole episode. It's a long one, folks.
Yeah, this is a situation where like we had some kind of basic questions about data that made us ask more questions, which kind of led into more questions.
Right.
And when all was said and done, we just had so much data that it just made sense to like just do a whole show on it.
Heck yeah. And with that, guys, I think we got to just get right into it. Let's start with one of our categories here, which is, I think, especially interesting to a lot of folks out there. Let's cover those flash in the pan commanders first. These commanders were really popular when maybe they first came out, but their popularity fell off really, really dang quickly. Let's talk about some commanders that people eventually stopped building with the same level of excitement as they initially showed.
So I think first we want to maybe define like what we've categorized as a flash in the pan commander. We had a couple criteria here we came up with. These were commanders that were released after January 1st, 2020. They achieved a rank of 10 or higher at some point. They left the top 50 within 6 months of achieving that peak. And once they left the top 50, they stayed out of the top 100 85% of the time.
Yeah, so we wanted to make sure that we were capturing commanders that people latched onto that were indeed popular for at least a short amount of time, but then folks kind of moved away from them. And so we want to really honor that whole like a blip on the radar type of, oh, it's here, oh, but now it's gone. And you really, everybody kind of forgot about it by then.
And if you're watching on YouTube, you're probably seeing a whole bunch of numbers, a whole bunch of commanders all in a list right here. How do we want to break this down, fellas?
I mean, so when we were looking through the results on this question and all the questions, we noticed some trends and some groupings that we definitely could kind of lump things into. So we're going to talk about chunks of commanders here, but really there's three main categories on a lot of these different kind of questions that we ask ourselves. So Joey, why don't we just start with category A, which is commanders that we kind of thought were kind of niche, maybe a little repetitive in their gameplay. And that is going to take out a big chunk of these commanders right here.
For sure, yeah. We can see on this heat map here that they started off really intensely green, but then that green fades over time as their top position of that month starts to get lower and lower and lower. And as you said, a whole bunch of them fit a category of having a kind of niche strategy. So as an example, top of the list here, Gavi Nest Warden is a Jeskai cycling deck. Well, that might have drawn some initial interest for the novelty. That's not a strategy that has received a whole bunch of support over time. And that is going to be true for a whole bunch of these that follow a similar structure, as you were mentioning. Yorn, God of Winter, a snow deck, or Tatsunari Toad Rider, a Sultai Enchantments commander. There's a lot of niche stuff that we can attribute to spiking up some early interest, but eventually falling out of favor very quickly, since there's not a whole lot of support long-term for these strategies.
Yeah, these are decks that like people build in the moment when the commander comes out, except for you'd never get to really tinker with it too much. I mean, occasionally a new toy will come out, but like at least for me, that's one of the things that keeps a deck feeling fresh is the ability to like tweak it a little bit and like make it play differently. And if your deck is really heavily built around some form of mechanic where we don't get new toys with, that can make that deck feel pretty stale. And I think that scared a lot of people away from these commanders that they built right away and then just kind of lost interest in.
Yeah, it's hard to keep interest in commanders like Kibo Uktabi Prince, which if you look at the map, it was number 4. It was the number 4 most popular commander for an entire month, but then dropped off extremely quickly. I know it was kind of hard to imagine that Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief for a while was ever going to be not popular because it was doing Simic enchantment, all sorts of really good things. And it's because you really get to do a specific few things. You might be doing them very, very well, but it turns out people kind of did the thing and then there was, oh, it's only doing one thing over and over and over again, no matter how efficient or not efficient.
That's kind of an important thing for us to point out here. In this category A that we've labeled, it is about niche strategies, but also about sometimes just a repetitive play pattern in some cases. I think that can sometimes be the case for like an Ivy deck. It can start to feel like the play patterns do define themselves pretty darn quickly, rather than promoting a lot of further exploration after the first few months of tinkering. I would say that fits the bill for other things we put here, like Hilda of the Icy Crown as well.
Yeah.
You're tapping stuff, and that game plan does seem to be pretty straightforward, and there's a very select group of cards that will help you enable that strategy. And so the deck kind of does what the deck is going to do, rather than having puzzles that you solve every turn, for instance. And that is certainly going to spike up some early interest, because those are novel places to explore for gameplay. But if you're going to be popular long term as a commander, I think you have to have a lot of general broad appeal. And these early spikes speak to a specific niche of players, a subset of players who enjoy that, but not necessarily that broad appeal, which is why even though they, became popular for a moment, not everyone was necessarily as intrigued so much as a section of the player base.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, whether it was because the deck was too niche and didn't get new tools or because it was repetitive, the end result is the same. People just got bored of these decks.
Well, and so the second category, it's not so much that folks got bored with these. I would say that this is a kind of a crowded field is a good way to describe this category, where it's commanders that are either in a color combination where we get a lot of support, or it's in a theme where you see commanders that are always supporting these things. I know the first one that jumps out to me right away is Obun Moldiah Ancestor, which was that was the number 9 commander for a time when it first came out. But very quickly, people realized, well, it's a landfall commander. Well, we already have a ton of landfall commanders. We know what the archetype is like. So it's not really breaking any ground. And it just wasn't excelling enough to really compete with everything else that was going on if you wanted a landfall commander.
And yeah, as you said, it did capture some very big early interest, but this is a commander that is trying to enter an already popular and already very populated space. Another that sticks out to me here is Angelo the Painter. Angelo the Painter, right after it was released, it was taking the number 1 spot, but then within 5 months, it was dropping down to only being 21st most popular, then 31st, then 45th, and it was just okay, now it has officially fallen out of the top 100. And that happened in less than 6 months. Or here's another quick example. We can look at 2 others here, Ziatora the Jund Fling and Treasures Dragon, and Belladros Witherbloom the Land Untapping Dragon, which have a lot in common. Both are dragons, obviously, but they also both had a strong start at rank 7, and then within 4 months, neither were in the top 100 most built each month anymore. And not only that, but they have something else in common here too. For those watching on the YouTube, you can see the blue squares showing up years later in each of their timelines, indicating when those cards got reprinted in 2024, in MH3 and Bloomborough respectively. We've done whole episodes about data when it shows how reprints drive more deck building energy to various cards and commanders on the website, but that wasn't the case for these. These ones here didn't get back into the top 100 after their reprints. They were still flash in the pan. They still only lasted in the top spots for barely even 4 months. They really only got to have that brief moment in the spotlight.
I mean, you want to talk about a fast dropping commander. Imodane the Pyromancer was the number 5 most built commander the month that it came out. But within 3 months, it was outside the top 100, which is wild to consider how fast it fell down, because I thought people were going to be way more attached to it than they were.
Zimone and Dina is another example of a commander that was only within the top 100 decks for 3 months. And the same is also true for Mirko Obsessive Theorist, which was very popular on its release in MKM. And then it fell right off a cliff. It really dropped out of the top 100 very, very quickly. And we are certainly seeing that pattern for these. And it is because something like Zimone and Dina doing some cool Sultai landfall stuff. Sultai doing some stuff with lands is huge. That's an enormous category to try and make your name in. That place is so crowded to try and do it. And a lot of other commanders out there have really dominated that space. Mirko Obsessive Theorist is Dimir Reanimator. And there's a lot of Dimir graveyard stuff going around. So it's admirable. I think those are really cool designs, but it is difficult for them to truly stake a permanent place in the top 100 when they have so much competition in a very popular play space.
Well, and to throw an anecdote out here, I have actually been in a pod with someone playing a Myco Tyrant deck, one of the commanders here on the list that fell way off, where somebody said, I'm thinking about turning my Myco Tyrant deck just into a Slimefoot deck. I think I'm just playing worse Slimefoot. And somebody else in the pod said, yeah, I had a Myco Tyrant deck and I did the same thing. Like literally in one pod, we had 2 people that acknowledged that they had a Myco Tyrant deck once upon a time and they turned it into Slimefoot.
I think that's an important thing to note, actually, is that sometimes it isn't just about the niche strategy that you're doing, landfall's already a crowded field, but also just Golgari doing graveyard stuff. That's all of the Golgari commanders, potentially. I speak with a little bit of experience there. There are plenty of Golgari commanders out there that are not doing just graveyard things, but the vast majority of them are. So any new Golgari Graveyard Commander is dealing with the entire history of Golgari commanders that it's trying to combat or contend with. And while some of them will have that early interest, not all of them can necessarily survive in that field long term.
Well, and you talk about things that have been tread on a lot. What about theft decks? Because we have two commanders that kind of fall into that category where you have Gonti Canny Acquisitor. Gonti was the number 5 most built commander when it was released. And within 2 months, it was gone. Yeah. Just people stopped building that commander. And then Tasha the Witch Queen. But both of those came out and just, it's not really doing anything extraordinary in that theme of trying to take your opponent's stuff, steal everything. And so when you're in such a crowded field like this, I feel like you really have to kind of change the game almost as far as how well are you doing something, how efficiently are you doing any given strategy, because otherwise, if you don't, this commander is just going to fall off like we see almost just like embarrassingly fast.
Yeah. And it's funny because I think there's some overlap here with, trying to steal your opponent's stuff as your main strategy. That also could be that category A we talked about of it being kind of a niche strategy as well. But what we are seeing is that it is receiving kind of consistent support over the years. Mm-hmm. Tasha came out in 2022. Gonti just came out in 2024. We've seen a lot of stuff that is interested in taking things from your opponents. But what we are realizing is that since it is receiving that consistent support, it is becoming more of a crowded field, and people have found some that work really, really well for them. And unfortunately, these two might have looked at first like they were going to be like the de facto, but they didn't necessarily survive it.
Yeah, the downside, like you said, Joey, of getting constant support for any given theme that you're doing is that likely means that you're getting a new commander that's going to support that theme the next time it's visited in a mainline set. So that puts even more pressure on a commander to have to be doing things head and shoulders above the rest of the competition, or do it in like a completely new color combination or something to make it unique and stand out.
Well, and Joey, you talked about overlapping with other categories. We have not even got to category C yet, which is, things that maybe generate not great gameplay. But that's a thing that like also can apply to cards like Tasha and Gonti Canny Acquisitor. That can just be annoying to have that commander and then have to keep track of who you took what cards from. Like for yourself, that can even be frustrating to the point where like, I just don't want to deal with this.
Well, it's funny, Dana, that you would say that the unfun part of that could be the fact that you as the Tasha or Gonti player have to keep track of other people's stuff, right? Compared to what I think was probably most people's immediate impulse of why they taking my stuff.
Right, sure, yeah. Well, and that is what the next category here we're going to talk about is things that like make kind of miserable gameplay experiences.
Yeah, the nice part about being able to help make show notes is I can put Toxroll in a category wherever I want to, because Toxroll the Corrosive is probably one of the most miserable play experiences I've ever had in Commander, and thankfully people caught on very, very quickly. Like, it started off as the number 2 most built commander of that month. And that's huge. That's a ton of numbers coming in when Toxroll first released. It stayed in the top 10. But then again, within 2 months, this thing really dropped off. And thankfully, I think the social aspect of the format really played a role in a lot of the commanders that we're going to talk about in this category specifically, where people kind of got to do the thing. Okay, you had fun. Can you not play that deck ever again, please? Probably was the conversation that we're going to have a lot with these.
Well, you joke about Toxroll, Matt, but like, yeah, that seems to be kind of the universal take. It's like, it's not just you that feels that way about Toxroll. A lot of the player bases, I think, kind of felt that way too. They did the thing and like, okay, I don't want to do that thing again.
These episodes are really just Matt's way of justifying that he's not alone in hating this particular slug.
Right.
You know what? This is data supporting my feelings, though. So this is like the perfect merger of what I wanted to be happening.
Amazing. Yeah, this final category of flash in the pan commanders that did not survive in the top spots for very long is, I think, actually one of the bigger sections of this huge list that we're seeing. You mentioned Toxroll as an example of something that kind of maybe drives the rest of the table a little bit crazy, and therefore during gameplay the appeal isn't there to like sustain a whole ton of interest for a whole lot of deck builders out there. And I think that goes for a whole bunch of others here too. For instance, Ixhel and Vishgraz were infect commanders that we got in a precon, which I think is a really interesting experiment for Wizards of the Coast just to try. But I don't know, there's a bit of a stigma around poison counters out there in Commander. So when people see your commander does poison, they're probably going to gun for you a little bit because a lot of people don't like just poison as a mechanic. And that could certainly drive down interest once you see how these things receive certain reactions during the actual gameplay portion, not just during the deck building portion.
Well, that's actually a really good point, Joey, because like when we talk about a miserable game experience, we tend to talk about like creating a bad time for everyone else, or the thing I mentioned with something like Gonti, maybe creating a bad time for you, keeping track of stuff as well. Mm-hmm. But the third axis of that is a commander that just frustrates your opponents enough where they remove it constantly,
sure.
and now you're playing a deck that you don't get to play. Mm-hmm. And like that's not fun either. And I think like something like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. So whenever you draw a card, you gain life, but more importantly, whenever your opponents draw a card, they lose 2 life. And I think like that constant dinging someone for 2 life whenever they cast any kind of a draw spell or even just during their draw phase, that's frustrating to play against. And like folks will do all they can to remove that Sheoldred. And that's not fun for you to be playing that card.
I mean, Judith Carnage Connoisseur is absolutely a commander that falls into this category too of either I don't get to play or you don't get to play. One of us is just going to have a miserable time.
Right.
So I play Judith in Brawl whenever I play Arena just to finish my daily quests, or when I really feel like just making sure nobody else has any fun either. But yeah, that commander absolutely cannot be on the battlefield because Barrage of Boulders suddenly turns into board wipes and just those types of decks where either I'm playing or you're playing and there's no in between. That's really just a terrible place to be. And it really leads to probably a bunch of these decks being taken apart.
And an important thing for us to note when we're, seeing the activity that like this heat map, so to speak, is measuring the biggest spike of deck building energy. Sheoldred is still like, I think currently the number 2 or 3 most popular mono black commander. What we've seen here is an initial rise of activity, and then that rise has like really not stayed consistent enough. So it's not that all of these are necessarily completely unpopular now, but they have certainly lost that initial momentum in a significant way. Sheoldred the Apocalypse on the list here that we're looking at this entire map, it's one of the commanders that has had the most of that staying power compared to some others that only lasted like 2 or 3 months. Miracle Lord of Bones is actually another example of one that seemed to have a decent amount of staying power as well. It made it about 6 months or so in the top 100. But then it really did fall off, and that momentum has just stagnated. There's not a lot of new energy being directed towards any of these commanders. So it doesn't mean that they're all now completely unpopular, but that energy has definitely been zapped away and seems to be carried towards a lot of other areas instead.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of context we probably could have let off with a little bit earlier, but just because a card or a commander isn't in the top 100 doesn't mean it's not popular, because as you're always seeing, we are getting more legends than ever before in the past couple of years. So the competition in general is just very, very thick. So it's saying it's something that stands in the top 100. It really is kind of this saying this is the cream of the crop. This is the 1% type of commanders out there. So the fact that any of these got into the top 100 for any given amount of time is really saying something.
To use an analogy the kids will understand, just because Taylor Swift's new album sold less copies than the previous album doesn't mean it didn't sell a lot of copies. Like, that drop-off might still be monumental.
Yeah, that's very true. But this is also one of my favorite things to see, one of my favorite of these big pieces of data that we've got, because what we are noticing is a lot of very early passion for a lot of very interesting legends that they've made. And in particular with this last category, of those commanders that it seems like people fell out of love with the play pattern or fell out of love with the exact way that these commanders were received. I also find some heart in that too, because I know that it can be a frustrating experience to build a deck that you're passionate about, and then maybe the table doesn't like Infect or doesn't like your slug putting, -1 counters on everything and stuff like that. But it is also a signal that players are becoming aware and paying attention to the way that other people feel, which is, in my opinion, one of the best things to do in a multiplayer game. You want to make sure that you're creating a joyful experience with everybody. So when I see, for instance, that Rowan Scion of War, another commander who only lasted in the top 100 for about 5 months or so, well, she's a great red-black, lose some life, and make all my spells super cheap combo deck is kind of what ended up happening with her. And when I see that she fell out of popularity, that kind of looks to me, at least, like people became aware of, this wasn't necessarily as much fun for everybody as I thought it was going to be. So maybe I'll put my deck building energies somewhere else instead. And I don't know, I find some heart in that. And that's why I think this category is so important to look over. This episode is brought to you by Archidect. Archidect is our favorite deck building website of choice, and if you're familiar with our Upping the Average series on YouTube, you'll know I've been a big fan of this site for years now. Archidect is full of features that can take all the hassle out of deck building online. For instance, did you know you can drag and drop cards from either EDHREC or Scryfall right into Archidect, and it will add those cards to your deck for you? Whenever I brew, I already have a bunch of searches on EDHREC and Scryfall open in other tabs anyway, so literally just clicking and dragging cards right into my deck list saves me so much time. That way I don't have to type out every single dang card name. Not only that, but they also have a great system for you to create packages of cards too. If there's a group of cards that you know you're going to add to more than one deck, say a list of staples or favorite ramp effects, a counterspell or combo suite that you really enjoy and that you want to build around in more than just one list, or even just a group of pet cards, whatever the case may be, you can save those groups of cards as packages and easily add them to your decks when you're brewing. Or even browse through other package ideas that other users have come up with. Archidect makes being a deck architect a total breeze. Check them out at archidekt.com. This episode is also brought to you by Spellify. Spellify is a hilarious magic card guessing game over on the website Commander's Herald. This game shows you a card but with all the text and art removed, and you can guess letters to fill in the blanks to try and identify what that card is. Think of it like Wordle, but with magic cards. See if you can guess the card by using as few letters as possible, just by recognizing how many letters are in its name or based on its activation costs and things like that, or see if you can guess it by not filling in any blanks at all. Real power move right there. There's even a Spellify hard mode for those extra daring aficionados out there. And of course, whenever you're done playing, Spellify's host site, Commander's Herald, is a great place to catch up on some of the spicy magic news of the day too. I know a lot of big names in Magic have been having a blast guessing the card of the day, so if you want to join in and have a little fun while you do, enjoy testing out your magic prowess over on Spellify.
Well, let's take a look at some commanders that actually did the reverse. So we talked about commanders that showed up and then kind of dropped off. I think it's worth looking at, and we asked the question of what are some commanders that have actually experienced like significant comebacks in the data. They lost a bit of popularity, but then they came back and maybe were popular than they were to start.
So to define this, we looked at a couple different criteria. Commanders that were released prior to 2024. They're ones that experienced a peak in the first half of the card's existence. Since that peak, it dropped below 50 at some point, and it then experienced another peak of 50 or higher. And the time between peaks had a mean ranking at 80 or lower. And the average ranking between peaks was lower than the average ranking within the 6 months surrounding the second peak.
So basically what that all means is that we wanted to make sure that we had specific parameters to make sure commanders truly did kind of lose their standing in the community as far as how popular they were. We wanted to make sure that there was a good amount of time too. They had to have a good chunk of time between when they were popular and then when they came back. Those are the two main things, and that's just kind of the methodology we use to kind of measure this specifically when looking at the data.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so excited about this one. This is my favorite chart of the ones that we've got. So if folks have ever wondered, oh, did that commander ever have an upswing again? Here are a couple fantastic examples of commanders that people stopped putting energy behind and then got right back into it for a couple of different types of reasons. And we broke these into 3 different categories as well. And the first one is definitely the most straightforward. The commander got a reprint that got a whole bunch of new attention on the card and therefore could put more deck building energy behind it. And the 2 examples that we can see here are, for instance, the original Marchesa the Black Rose. She hadn't received a reprint for a long time, but then she got a reprint in Double Masters in 2022. And you can see her numbers spike right back up, launching her back into the top 50 most built commanders of that week, and then held some interest for a while after that, since it was easier to get copies of her. And the same is also true for Ramos Dragon Engine, which actually received a retro border reprint in Brothers War in late 2022. And that also invigorated a little bit more energy back to that one.
Yeah, those cards just were so old that most Magic players weren't even playing back then at this point. So it's good to just kind of re-inject interest because the fact that more people just know Marchesa and Ramos even exist, definitely the recipe to make sure that a commander is going to see a resurgence.
Yeah, like we kind of take that for granted. Like we all know Marchesa, the Black Rose exists, But us and people listening to this channel aren't necessarily the average Magic player. And I think a lot of people just don't know cards exist if they don't see them. And a card like Marchesa, if you don't see it, you don't even know it's an available option for you necessarily. And price can matter too.
Yeah.
And look at something like Marchesa, Marchesa was, $8 or so, I think, before that reprint. And it dropped down to be a very affordable, I think around $2 after. That may not seem like a lot, but that is a lot of money to a lot of people. And so in some cases, it's an even wider swing than that. So all those factors kind of add up. And just in general, getting a reprint makes things more accessible.
We see that all the time in, cards for the 99 as well. We've done a whole episode about the power of reprints and how those can launch sometimes more obscure cards into bigger popularity. Mm-hmm. As a recent example that happened just the end of this past year, I was probably going to do a challenge the stats on the card Sentinel Hierophants, which is a thing that can make your creatures tap for mana. And then it got reprinted in Duskborn. And I'm like, well, okay, people know about it now. So then maybe never mind. I'll take it off my challenge to stats spreadsheet list.
Yeah, absolutely will happen. That's an easy way to get interest in a commander, but also getting more support for a commander. That's kind of our second category here as far as pools that we want to put all these commanders in. And these are going to be cards like Anya Falconwrath, where it's doing something very, very specific, where it's a madness kind of almost a combo deck for a lot of people when they build it. But there's only a very finite amount of cards with the mechanic Madness on it, so you can discard something with Madness to untap Anya again and kind of do that whole loop thing. Well, we didn't get really a whole lot of Madness cards until Modern Horizons 2, when suddenly all those Anya players or people who wanted to build the deck finally saw more than 17 options of Madness cards you can put in the deck.
Mm-hmm. She was seeing a drop off. It was very popular back in 2020, was, the number 13 most popular commander of that month, but it was drifting down, down, down. And then when that set came out and she got a whole bunch of other Madness support, she launched back up in mid-2021 to the 33rd most popular. So she got to see a comeback just because she got a bunch of new toys.
And speaking of new toys, there's commanders like Magda Brazen Outlaw that cares about two different things, cares about treasures and cares about dwarves. And we got more treasures in New Capenna in 2022, and we got more dwarves in the Lord of the Rings in 2023. So that is a really specific deck that wants two things that we don't regularly get, and we started regularly getting them again. So we talked about commanders that fell off because they, didn't have anything that gave them new toys or made the deck fresh, didn't get anything that really changed things up. Well, this is a deck that got a bunch of things that it wanted all of a sudden over the span of 2 years, and it swung back upwards in popularity.
This applies to commanders that were super popular at one point in time, whether it's the first sliver or commanders who they had a little bit of a rival. Hazazon, the Shaper of Sand, which was the new Hazazon. It wasn't super popular, but it did fade out just because you only have so many things you can do with either slivers or deserts, basically. But then when you get a little bit, you can just push those back up there. First Sliver got to see a huge resurgence when we got the Sliver Precon recently. Same as when we had Outlaws at Thunder Junction that featured deserts all over the place. Mm-hmm. That really got people building Hazazon, Shaper of Sand as well. And so it doesn't have to be commanders that were hugely popular when they first came out. It can be kind of side players almost even too.
Yeah, I love the Hazazon point on this graph because you see Hazazon immediately fall off. It was spot number 13th most popular, and then within 2 months, it fell out. But then in 2024, you see it alive again. You see it blip back up on the radar. And that's why I like this particular chart so much. Folks, if you're not watching on the YouTube, you really got to check these out. The images are so interesting. Thank you again, Julia, for putting these together. Because it's just Hazazon was just a blip, and then finally it's swung back in. And it is because of things like reprints or getting a bunch of new toys or things like that. It's just, I don't know, just a cool thing to see. It's alive, I guess, to see that happen with these.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, this is kind of the inverse of Category 1. In Category 1, the deck swung back up because the commander re-entered kind of the general EDH consciousness. In this case, the deck swung back up because the pieces for the deck re-entered the EDH consciousness. Mm-hmm. Slivers, that's going to happen regularly. And I would bet if we look over, if we do this kind of show again 10 years from now, we'll see the same thing with sliver decks because we tend to every 3 or 4 years get some set that injects more slivers. And I would bet that trend will repeat itself over the course of, the next decade.
Yeah, all of these commanders, if it weren't for the help that they got years later, we would have been talking about as being blips in the previous category. But instead, because they got to see a little bit of a comeback, they kind of get their own category here. A couple of them actually are going to be commanders that we're going to talk about in this third category, actually, which is something happened outside of the cards being printed that reinvigorated people to be building these commanders again. So one big one I know is Xyrus the Writhing Storm, which was actually pretty popular by its own works. It came out as the number 4 most built commander, spent a good amount of time in the top 50 and slowly died out a little bit. But the Salubrious Snail YouTube channel built a deck and did a whole video over Xyrus the Writhing Storm and immediately launched that commander right back into public consciousness. It's actually the most viewed deck on Architect right now is the deck from this video.
Yeah. In this case, it's literally just a situation of that commander got popular because something went viral, which we aren't usually able to necessarily measure immediately. But here it's pretty clear cut why that commander from, its popularity in 2020 would swing right back in 2024. And not only this, but this one has actually definitely sustained its position within the top 100 must build decks as well. So yeah, just the power of virality, Matt, as you were saying, this category all about some event occurred.
Yeah. I mean, all of these are just some variant on a deck being put back in front of our eyeballs. That might take the form of a reprint. It might take the form of more support. And in this category, it's taking the form of some event that's like pushing it back in kind of the general consciousness. Kinnan, Bonner Prodigy, I believe, is one where it won a CEDH tournament in early 2024. And that just drew attention to the commander in a way that it hadn't had attention for a few years. And people started brewing that deck.
The same thing that we got to see with Tivit Seller of Secrets, where there was a CEDH event, it won the event and just had a little bit of a support, and then it's able to just kind of get itself back in the public consciousness for a measurable amount of time.
Tivit's an especially interesting example because while it did experience a comeback, here in 2024, it has once again fallen out of the top 100. And I think this is kind of an example, both the Kinnan and the Tivit examples here, of just overall shifts in the CEDH meta.
Yeah.
As certain lines with these commanders that they're able to facilitate fall in and out of favor as new pieces are discovered or slight new toys are given to each commander. So it kind of speaks to the ways that CEDH can be ever shifting and difficult to stay in exactly one place for a long period of time. So CEDH players, you're seeing a lot of shifts in the popularity of these commanders based on some probably presence in tournaments and people discovering new lines and stuff like that. It's very interesting to see the CEDH move so many numbers with these very famous and very powerful commanders. The lines that these things are able to do is truly very wild. So frankly, I'm not surprised that they would be able to put up so many numbers. Yeah, this one especially is just so interesting to me. And listeners, I'm kind of curious if you think there are any other commanders that might be primed for a comeback in the future as well. With that, though, I think we got to move on to another one of our graphs here. And this one's big. This one's probably one of the biggest images we'll be throwing on screen.
Yeah, well, we've been talking this whole episode so far about commanders that came in, left, or came back sometimes. And so this is the one that we're going to dig into, where these are the commanders that kind of the tried and true, the slow and steady, or popular and steady, I guess we should say. But these are going to be the ones that had staying power over a significant course of the time, their entire lifetime. So these are commanders that, on average, have gone no lower than the top 50. And so there's going to be basically all of your all-stars that we're going to talk about in this category.
And in particular, we're starting off with the older ones of the group, specifically commanders that came before the year 2022. Why is that our cutoff point? Because there's a lot of numbers here, and there are a lot of very popular commanders that were just printed in the last 2 years as well. So specifically, this graph that we're showing here, these are commanders that were released pre-2022 and have remarkably held onto top spots within the top 100 for a significant length of time. Let's dive into it. What different categories of traits do the commanders on this graph have in common?
So category A here, we're kind of calling best in class. And this is just a cluster of commanders that feature creature types in a way that no other commander that does that thing can kind of do it better. For me, I always come to Krenko Mob Boss here. There's just not a commander that's going to do goblin stuff better than Krenko does goblin stuff. and the rest of these commanders are kind of some variant on that. It's doing the thing better than any deck is just going to be doing that thing.
Yeah, if they build a goblin commander that does it better than Krenko Mob Boss, something went very wrong in the design team. Where but it's kind of the same thing. Edgar Markov is the same type of thing where if they ever build a vampire deck that is more broken than Edgar Markov, I'm going to be very worried for this. This is the state of Magic because of how powerful it is. When we say best in class, especially for this category right here, these commanders have been around for so long and so dominant because, like we said, with commanders that didn't really do anything unique enough to stay around very long, these commanders are doing that unique thing that makes them just so hard to unseat.
Yeah, and it's not like other vampire commanders haven't come out to try. It's not like, Muxus is a really fun goblin commander. I really, really like Muxus. But Krenko is still just like, yeah, but I'm top dog, and it's going to stay there.
Yeah.
Another example of this is the classic Dragon as well, or Lathril, Blade of the Elves. Elves and dragons are heckin' popular. And if you look at their rows here on this chart, that's some deep green going on here. Like those are not moving, even despite a lot of other very powerful dragon commanders that have come out recently. If anything, that's only bolstered the Dragon's popularity rather than ever unseating it. And the same is true for Lathril. So that's just very, these best-in-class creature type commanders, it doesn't seem like they're going anywhere.
Well, and when you add in Wilheltz that's doing the zombie thing, it's funny because we talk about how, so this certain archetype, the dragons, for example, it's going to make other dragon decks that much better. Like you said, Joey, no, it just makes dragon decks that much better too. And so that's why those decks aren't going anywhere, because these are just so good and they absorb all of the support. You might have a commander that could be really interesting. You might have something that may be a little more limited, but it just doesn't matter because these commanders are just so much better, just head and shoulders above anything else we're ever going to get.
Well, and when we're talking about, really popular creature types like vampires and dragons and elves and zombies and goblins, you wouldn't think squirrels would be part of that category. But for whatever reason, like that was one of the most requested things for a whole lot of years, was a commander to be at the top of a squirrel deck. And when they finally printed one in Chatterfang Squirrel General, they printed the best version of that card we're ever going to see. So that's just the commander that you are going to run with a squirrel deck.
Well, and the wild thing about Chatterfang's graph specifically is this almost could have gone into the comeback territory where we got Chatterfang. It was very popular for a long time, but it took a while, but it eventually worked its way down. But then Bloomborough happened, and we got all the squirrels all over again. And so it really did invigorate people getting excited for Chatterfang to be built again. And so it is just absolutely wild to me that Chatterfang almost slipped through, but then the perfect circumstance came up. Like, we're not going to get a Bloomborough type of circumstance again for a commander like Chatterfang.
Right.
Yeah. And crucially, it specifically never actually fell completely out of the top 100 the way that we saw some of the others do. It fell down to, rank 73 or so. Still within the top 100, but it seemed like it might be on its way to fading. And then no.
Nope.
And then no.
Not at all.
But you're right. It is unique compared to some of the other commanders that we just named, because like Wilheltz has not budged. Like it has not experienced any of that fade. And if I'm being honest, I don't think it or stuff like the Dragon maybe ever will. Those are titans of the format. And that is one of the biggest things for us to capture here, is that, people like building around creature types. And these are some, as you said, best in class.
I think, and I truly stand by this, if any of these 6 ever get unseated as the best or de facto option for whatever given creature type they are, that's a significant problem, because these are just doing things. Yes, they were ahead of their time. They're still ahead of their time if they would have been released today.
Right.
I think that's kind of telling, that especially Dragon and Edgar Markov, I mean, you can credit to Eminence being such an inappropriate ability to ever put on a card again. That's fine. But man, I really hope that none of these are ever one-upped by a new card.
Well, and then we go to category B. So category A was a list of commanders that were really specifically powerful atop a certain deck. To category B, that's just filled with commanders that are generally powerful almost no matter how you build them. And the poster child for this is something like Korvald, Fakehurst King. Right?
Yep.
Almost anything you're doing in that color group is just going to be better if you're doing it in a Korvald deck.
I mean, I'd say the poster child is Atraxa Praetor's Voice, the #1 commander in the entire EDHREC database with over 36,000 decks to its name. It is ranked #1, and it is one of the deepest green lines we see on all of these heat maps, on all of these charts, because it has maintained being in the top 10 most built commanders every month for nearly its entire existence, because it's such a versatile powerhouse that can lead so many different strategies.
Like, it's just a powerful card. It's always going to be a powerful card. Maybe some other good things will come along. It's just still, though, always going to be really, really good.
Yeah, you say Korvold, I say Muldrotha. It's the same thing. It's just a commander that's just so open-ended, and it's so powerful in what it does. It's just going to be powerful and desirable even in today's design standards.
An interesting thing that I'm noticing, especially about the ones you just mentioned, is that like they've also received some regular reprints as well. We can see these blue squares on the graph that point out that Muldrotha has received a reprint in late 2020 and also in mid 2022, and then also again in late 2024. So like their popularity has also sustained enough interest from the player base that Wizards has caught on and said, hey, let's make sure that people have access to this thing because people like it so much. Yeah, there are a handful of those that their popularity is keeping them around, especially in the eyes of Wizards. I think another interesting thing to note here is sort of the bridge between categories A and B, because there is sort of a generically powerful aspect to a whole bunch of them that also fits into the fact that they can sometimes be very niche. And that makes it a little bit tricky to place certain ones. Like Chatterfang, we mentioned, squirrels are popular, but Chatterfang also has a lot of competitive or combo territory to play into. And the same is also true for Eureka. Eureka people love because ninjas are awesome, but it's also a very powerful competitive deck as well. And it sort of fits both of these categories here, which means I think that it's just like sort of doubling down on that eternal popularity of each of those. I don't think they're going anywhere because of two reasons. They appeal to people who just like ninjas, but also appeal to people who like doing some really, really powerful stuff as well. And they're so powerful that they fit into both of these categories, including this just powerhouse version in category B.
But you also have commanders that are just generally so open-ended, and they give you all the colors. There's Kenrith the Returned King, which is kind of the de facto, do you want all 5 colors? And something that's kind of relevant whenever you need. Kenrith the Returned King, I guess. It's been so omnipresent for so long. Just because there's not really any real downside to playing it. If, we talked about the Golos ban from years and years ago, Kenrith really just stepped in and kind of filled a good amount of that void that the Golos ban left.
I remember way back when we did set reviews, and we first got a look at Muldrotha the Gravetide, and I specifically recall saying, I don't know if we'll see that many Muldrotha decks because, Marin already exists, Carador always exists, doing the same thing. People didn't care. They built Muldrotha anyway. and Marin is still sticking around in this list as something that's just generally good too. Like, it didn't cut into Marin's utility really. People just built Muldrotha in addition to Marin.
I will say, at least for Marin of Clan Nel Toth specifically, she strikes me as being very unique on this particular chart because of the lines that are here, hers is one of the most faded, so to speak. A lot of the others, Atraxa Praetor's Voice, for instance, talk about a best in class, one of the most like this one is just ones across the board, number 1 spot, number 2 spot. That one is not just within the top 100, it's consistently within the top 10. But Marin is sort of drifting more and more towards like the 40s or so, or towards the 50s. So of the options here, Marin seems potentially most likely to eventually move out of the top 100 compared to all the other competition on this particular chart, which I just think is worth noting. But she certainly has not fallen out of that top 100 yet.
Well, which is wild to me because I would think if I had to guess which commander that was kind of a mainstay that wouldn't keep up, Kali the Vast is a commander that I kind of just thought, well, it's kind of repetitive in ways that we talked about with other commanders that haven't stuck around near as long. But Kali the Vast still maybe gets more popular every set because we're always getting a big splashy dragon, usually getting big splashy angels and big splashy demons. So Kali just somehow is fighting every expectation I would have had for her and sticking around the top 100, which is just, it's silly to me.
Yeah, she is getting more and more popular over time. You're right. And
somehow, it doesn't make sense.
yeah, but like in 2020, she was in like the 60s or so, 60th most popular. And currently here in 2024, she's up in like rank number 9 or 10.
And it's one of those commanders too that like has, multiple build paths. They're the kind of the same build path, but it feels different. And like you can go angels, demons, and dragons, or you can go just angels or just demons or just dragons. But like that's enough, I think, to keep people playing and keep people coming back.
There's kind of an interesting inverse between the Marin and Kali example that I want to briefly mention here because, Matt, on a previous episode, I think very recently, you said it does feel like a Marin has possibly been outclassed by a couple of other Golgari commanders, or at least it no longer is necessarily the de facto Golgari, and that field is becoming more crowded. So she has to fight for her place a little bit more.
Sure.
And it's interesting to see Kalia, going up and up and up. And by comparison, Kali was very famous for being so strong. I almost wonder here if it feels like maybe Marin is having a moment of like, okay, how do I actually keep up with where the format is going? Whereas with Kalia, it seems like the rest of the format has maybe caught up to her, is almost a way that I find myself interpreting the data that we're seeing for each of those here on this chart.
Maybe. I mean, that is a really good observation. So it's for as old as Kalia is, because Kalia's been around for almost as long as Commander has been, but Kalia in 2024 was a top 10 most built commander for multiple months in a row.
Yeah.
So it's so wild to see that. But then Marin, which is, to me, that was one, again, it was not quite in the class of Krenko, where if we ever outdo that, there's a problem. But at the same time, I don't know if it's so much passing Marin by, but definitely catching up to what Marin was doing. And also they're finding ways to explore that still. There's so much competition for just Golgari things and Simic things and whatever. And I think that's probably the most in play, is there's just a lot of competition in Golgari colors that it's just taking some attention away from Marin, where you could play Marin as your zombie commander because it still was a really good zombie commander.
Yeah.
But now we've gotten some actual proper zombies and proper Golgari commanders. So maybe that's kind of what's tearing a little bit out there, kind of because you could use Marin as kind of a Kenrith stand-in in Golgari colors.
Yeah, I like that interpretation.
Yeah, I think that really hits it on the head there, Matt. I think we will continue to get Golgari things that do things that Marin does. We will not continue to get things in Mardu colors that do what Kalia does.
Exactly.
Kalia gives you access to black and red angels. It gives you access to white and black dragons. It gives you access to red and white demons. Nothing else will be doing that. Whereas Marin is going to always have some competition from new things doing Golgari things because Marin does Golgari things.
Totally. Well, those were the first two categories here in this commanders with staying power, the best in class of creature types, and then also generically super powerful commanders that have dominated. But Matt, what's our third category here?
So our third category here is one that I'm pretty sure everybody was probably screaming at their screens already, but it's just going to be partners. Partner is the most broken mechanic maybe in Commander's history. It just did so many things to the format, socially and in the deck building process. They're just generically powerful and useful in so many situations, especially the original grouping of the partner commanders, whether it's Timna the Weaver, Thrasios Triton Hero, all of those just super open-ended, give you some color access, giving you two colors. If any of our listeners were playing back then, it was so hard to manage, and it was so hard to find a pod that didn't have partners sitting down.
And there were so many partners on this commanders with staying power list that we had to give them their own category here. And this really speaks to, again, a lot of their impact in the CEDH format, because partners are so powerful at giving you color access in that format. You mentioned Timna and Thrasios. Also here we see things like Rogok, son of Roga, and Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. These ones are certainly some titans of the CEDH end of the format.
Yep.
In the future of this category is really going to depend on what Wizards design does with partners.
Sure.
If we never get any more open-ended partners, well, these might slowly fade away. But every time we get a new partner that allows you to pair them with one of these commanders, they're just going to continue to stay strong. People will still build the decks because these commanders are all really, really good in almost any situation. And just giving them some new commander to pair with, to find some new way to let them continue to be really, really good, is just going to keep them hanging around forever. Whereas I think if we get more Friends Forever-esque pairings where you aren't allowed to pair these with whatever the new commanders are, then that's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Doing choose a background, doing partner with, anything, any variation on the partner mechanic. I hope they continue to do that. But even then, you get the single color commanders with partner. That's still a 3-color deck because you have the original cycle that all had 2 colors.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's really just put themselves in a corner that they can't really put that genie back in the bottle either, which is probably the biggest struggle because it puts a damper on so much design space they otherwise could have explored. But thankfully, like we said, they do backgrounds, they do partner with, they do find other ways to kind of tinker with that original partner mechanic in a way that isn't so damaging almost to the format.
Yeah, I think that's an important note when we're summarizing our final feelings on this particular graph, is that a lot of these are commanders that I feel like I've heard Wizards designers say, yeah, we probably went a little too far in a couple of places with some of these designs. That is one of the things that made them so beloved and so powerful, but they are not the kind of things that we want to try and see them upended or ousted from these positions. These sort of sit at a certain cap, and we kind of hope that they don't get power crept out anytime soon, Matt, as you were saying there.
Yep.
Very, very interesting. But these were just the commanders with staying power, the super popular titans of the format from before 2022. We've also seen a bunch of new commanders within just the past 2 years or so that have also got quite a lot of staying power that seem to be newer potential titans of the format.
A whole other list that we get to go through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you thought we were going to move on to a different question, I mean, we don't. We just have so many commanders because there's some really powerful commanders that were printed after 22, like Joey said.
Mm-hmm. What are we looking at for the possible categories of commanders in this big section?
So we're going to use the same categories here. We're going to start off with the creature types, but we actually get some different ones, a little bit, a few new commanders. Stuff like Giada, Font of Hope, which gives mono white angels finally a chance to shine that didn't really have an opportunity. And it did kind of fall off a little bit, but thankfully we get new angels fairly regularly, which means that Giada is always getting fuel to stay relevant in the commander at large meta because, man, angels, they just need a home, and Giada's a fantastic home for all those angels.
Yeah, and something like Miriam. Like, is Miriam as powerful as the Dragon? I'm not sure, but it's not much weaker, and it lets you do it in 3 colors. So again, while this might not be the slam bang number one choice for a Dragon commander, well, it is if you're going to play it in those 3 colors and don't want to play a 5-color deck.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you want a cheaper mana base, Myram is definitely the Dragon of today's design.
It's so good. It was in the number 1 spot for the first 3 months of its existence, and it was in the top 10 for like basically the next 6, and now it's like hovering in the top 20s spot or so. But like, yeah, Miriam ain't going anywhere. A little bit newer than the Dragon, but it's joining the same ranks.
And despite the fact that I know how it's pronounced, for some reason, I always call it Miriam, like it's the 5th Golden Girl or something.
I was going to say Myram as an anecdotal experience of how powerful that commander is. Dana, you and I were at Command Fest San Francisco a while back, and we did a commander sealed event where you draft a bunch of packs and you kind of build your decks from there. I had a draft deck for Myram Sentinel Worm that I played against normal commander decks and still won. That's how stupid it was.
Like, even in a deck filled with just those mediocre, overcosted, uncommon dragons from that set,
Still great.
it still just crushes.
It's still mega powerful, and it's a little obscene.
Yeah.
I got Miriam in a pack 1 pick 1 when I drafted Baldur's Gate once, and I drafted maybe the best deck I will ever draft ever. We played like 3 games, and I was the archenemy every single time, and I barely lost the last one.
You have to be.
Yeah, it's so good. That commander's cracked, and as we can see on this chart, people like it, and it is not leaving the top 100 anytime soon. It's barely even moved out of the top 20.
Yeah.
I think the other 3 commanders that we have here too, they're also just so powerful in the creature type that they're doing. So you have Pantlaza, you have Hawkball, you have Ulalek that are all kind of doing some fairly specific things in creature type decks that don't have very many great options. Pantlaza especially, you have this super powerful, casually focused dinosaur. I think folks were really, really excited about that. It had a pre-constructed deck to go along with it. So I also don't think any of those 3 are going anywhere anytime soon either.
Pantlaza especially represents, I think, a break from other Dino commander options. Gishath was so all eggs in one basket.
Yep.
It kind of like felt like the top end of your curve that then like basically everything has to go right with Gishath for Gishath to do the things of spitting a bunch of dinos into play.
Yeah.
Whereas Pantlaza actually represents a more gradual and value-based type of option. And it seemed like players were really, really keen to have that different point of attack, I guess, on that particular creature type to build around.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, with something like Ulalek or with Hawkball as well, those are creature types that are, frankly, quite beloved. People really like Merfolk. Prof alone probably drives so many people to play Merfolk because of how much he loves it, too. But then Eldrazi is also quite an interesting and especially unique creature type for people to build around. So I am not at all surprised to see the sustained interest that is surrounding some of these, especially just because of how powerful and how well they enable those particular strategies and can bring them to the forefront, even in fights against other hyper-popular things like Miriam in the first place.
So category B here, moving away from the ones that care about creature types, These are just kind of generically powerful best of the best, rather than being the best at kind of a creature type. These are the best at a specific thing. And I think kind of the poster child for this is Sheen 2 Heavens at 1. Marduk colors, and if a creature attacking causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it just does it an additional time. People love attacking, and people love doubling stuff. And this does both of the things that I just said that people love. It doubles stuff when you attack. Like they're just probably not going to print a better version of this. And it's an easily understood ability that's very strong that we constantly get. This is always going to be refreshed. Every set is going to give us something new with an attack trigger. Like it hits all of the boxes that you would create if you wanted to make a commander that was going to stick around and be popular for a long time.
Yeah, there are a handful of them here that just strike me as like they have a particular type of strategy, but also just they're so powerful within that strategy. Dana, you were mentioning Isheen there, but also the new one from 2024, the Necrobloom, is also such a powerhouse of a landfall graveyard dredge enabling commander, and its interest has definitely maintained itself ever since it saw print. I don't think that is going down anytime soon at all. Gearson Starn actually strikes me as another, like, yeah, it's doing something that is kind of niche. It wants to just ping you a little bit and then turn that one ping into even more pings. But it has maintained quite a lot of interest for a long time because of just how powerful it turns out this deck is able to be.
Yeah, Necrobloom, they're probably never going to print a better Field of the Dead as a creature. This is the one shot at it, and it's going to be around doing those things for many, many years.
Well, Joey, you had mentioned something about just things are always going to be powerful. 5 color decks, I feel, are always going to be powerful, especially with the way that design's going. We recently had Go Shintai Vlice Origin, which has been super popular, and it almost looks like it was getting ready to trail off for a little bit there recently, and then just jump right back up, so don't worry about that. But it's the 5 color enchantments, so you can return enchantments from your graveyard to the battlefield. You also had Jodah the Unifier, another 5 color way to just get a ton of value out of all of your cards that you're playing. They try to disguise Jodah as a Legend Matters type of theme, but we have accidentally so many legends that you just play a regular deck and everything's benefits from Jodah the Unifier being on the battlefield. And those are just, it kind of reduces a little bit of what could have been really cool design because we just have so much splash damage almost that makes these overwhelmingly popular instead of this could have been a cool, clever design.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the same goes for Voya.
Oh, yeah.
Not in the 5 color conversation, but commanders that it seemed like, oh, that could be interesting. And then you see them in game and you're like, right, if that lives for 1 turn, I die. Cool, got it. But like, that is exciting. So I'm not surprised to see that people really, really enjoy tinkering around with those and getting to do that wild stuff that EDH, frankly, is quite famous for.
I mean, thankfully, also, we did get Voya, and it was annoying to see Ward on everything. Mm-hmm. But because of Voya, we're not going to see near as much Ward in the future, thankfully.
There you go.
As Gavin Verhey did the video kind of saying, maybe we overdid it with Ward. So at least Voya exists to be a learning lesson.
Yeah.
And that is a little comforting.
Yeah, I think a lot of these are commanders that Wizards of the Coast has learned from in as much as the players have too. Yeah, that's a great observation. Mm-hmm. Well, and Matt, those were the first 2 categories of like newer commanders that have demonstrated a lot of staying power. But what's our third category of them?
So our third category, it might be actually as contentious as Voya's design is. It's going to be Universes Beyond, and it's just commanders that have been designed the past few years that just, they're so popular because they're iconic characters from whatever IP that they're bringing into Magic the Gathering. So whether this is Sam and Frodo, which is one of my favorites, those are just going to be evergreen, I think, for a long, long time. But you also have super popular commanders from Fallout, like Mr. House has been extremely popular since its release. And then it goes into Gearson Starn, like you mentioned, and Ezio Auditore, just one of the most popular commanders from the year. All Universes Beyond is doing a great and fantastic job at bringing all these eyes onto the game and giving people that play Magic an opportunity to play characters they know from their other hobbies. Yes, we have other hobbies beyond Magic the Gathering. I love Lord of the Rings, so I loved Universes Beyond, but I know it was kind of a contentious thing with how much it has coming up.
Well, I mentioned that we won't get another Field of the Dead as a creature because they just wouldn't do that. But like, this is kind of a similar situation, right?
Yeah.
We have no idea if we will ever see Lord of the Rings stuff on cards again. We don't know if we will ever see, things from Warhammer 40K on cards again. And if we do, it might not be this particular group of characters. So like, you just may never get another chance to build a Sam and Frodo deck aside from the existing Sam and Frodo. Mm-hmm. So you might never get a chance to build a Gersten Starn deck aside from the existing Gersten Starns. Like, these are things that in a weird way or that might just never get repeated, and this is your only chance to play the thing that you would want to play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it is interesting to note too, just looking just at the numbers, Sauron the Dark Lord is the deepest green on this entire chart. That line has not faded in any way compared to a lot of the other ones here that have occasionally dipped down into the 40s instead of being in the top 20 or something like that. But Sauron is just like, nah, I'm consistently up here. It's skyrocketed to the number one most popular Grixis commander in a very quick amount of time, and it is clearly demonstrated that it can stay there for a long time as well. So the eyes that this is drawing from people who don't originally play Magic, and the way that it can activate another love that Magic players have as well, clearly the data is just showing us that those numbers are like, it is paying off in terms of them.
And the Eye of Sauron that is coming onto this game. Yeah, you're right, Joey.
The eyes that wow. Fans of Magic the Gathering and Commander may already know EDHREC, but fans of one game also often play others, and we wanted to let folks who play both Magic and Flesh and Blood out there know that the team that brought you EDHREC also helped put together FabRec, as in Flesh and Blood recommendations. It's EDHREC, but for Flesh and Blood, including all the same deck analysis for the different heroes in the game, their starting weapons, and their breakdowns of cards that are most commonly played in their decks. Since Flesh and Blood isn't a singleton format like Commander, I know, a real novel concept to us EDH heads out there, it shows you not just the popularity of cards, but also the average number of copies played in those decks too. And of course, FabRec features some terrific strategy articles too by community members like Van Sant and even friend of the show, Riss. My family raised me on card games, so I could never get enough of them. And that's why Flesh and Blood is something I've strongly been considering trying out, but I don't always know where to start. And thankfully, FabRec is here to help out. So if you ever find yourself interested, not just in Commander, but in Flesh and Blood as well, give FabRec a look. All right, guys. Well, there's another kind of interesting commander that we also want to point out on these staying power graphs that we're seeing. It was actually printed in 2021. So back on that first graph that we showed, that was Prosper Tomebound. And this one's pretty interesting. It might have caught the eye of folks who were looking at it earlier. We actually kind of don't even want to just discuss this as a commander that has some staying power, because its numbers are a little bit weird compared to the others on that chart. It might almost be more appropriate to talk about Prosper in another chart of ours, which is the commanders that have faded over time. They were Titans, but they have apparently started to potentially fade out of those top 100 spots, and Prosper seems like it's going to be one of those candidates.
Mm-hmm.
So the criteria we came up with for commanders that faded out, they have to have had at least 8 months between the peak ranking and the first time they leave the top 50. They have to have had at least 6 months after leaving the top 50, so it can't be too recent. And after leaving the top 50, had an average rank of 85 or lower. And obviously, they should not have had a comeback as well, because then they would be on the rebound list.
And an important thing here is, first of all, this is very different than the commanders that had that immediate dropout or drop off going on, where it was like within a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
These are much longer periods of them fading away from the top 100.
Yeah.
But what's even more important is that just because these commanders fell out of the top 100 doesn't mean that they have faded into complete obscurity. It just means that it has capped.
Yeah.
It's no longer seeing the same consistent growth as so many other famous commanders still experience.
Yeah, like we mentioned, it top 100 is a very, very high bar to climb. Mm-hmm. So just because it's outside the top 100 doesn't mean it's not still pretty dang popular.
So for instance, what makes Prosper so interesting is that he's still in the top 100 commanders overall, but on a month-to-month basis, he's not in the top 100 most built anymore. Over the course of 2023, he slipped from the top 20s into the 40s, and then in 2024, he dipped into the 60s, the 90s, and then isn't among the top 100 most built on a month-by-month basis any longer. Now, his initial popularity was so strong for long enough that he's still got a top spot overall just by raw deck count number, but he appears to be fade-ing, even if he hasn't yet fade-id. And that's what we want to discuss in this chart. Not stuff that went away completely, but simply the legends that had big spots and are either fade-id or fade-ing. As time goes on, they are waning slowly out, rather than holding that position.
Yeah, Prosper was really hard for us because when we look at the commanders who had the staying power, we said these commanders have been in the top 50 on average their entire lifetime, or at least the time we were looking at. Prosper may have dropped off recently, but it's been so popular for so long. So it's kind of a weird situation, but it is a good segue into where we are with commanders that have indeed faded over time. The populator has declined, and Prosper was just a top 10 commander routinely for a long time. And so even though it's just now, just very, very recently dropped out of the top 100, it looks like a good opportunity to talk about a lot of other commanders who were indeed also very popular for a long time, but have lost some of their luster as the years have progressed.
All right, what are we looking at for possible categories of commanders in this section?
One thing to bear in mind too, there's just so many factors at play here. Like, the first category here we're going to talk about is the crowded field. So there's situations where like something else may have came along and made people switch to this commander.
Sometimes a newer thing comes along and pushes a commander out of the player's eye. Omnath Locus of Creation was popular for a long time, but then the thing that came along was just another Omnath. It was just the fourth or fifth version of Omnath coming along that really pushed another one out there, because Omnath Locus of Creation, much like every other version that we've had, was in the top 25 for a long time. It was very, very popular. Every single one always seems to be. But then over time, we get more and more Omnaths that are just going to replace them and somehow do better than the last version.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of landfall, Yarok the Desecrated also seems to fit this category as well.
Oh, yeah.
That's a great landfall commander. It's a great ETB commander. There's a lot of amazing stuff that Yarok can do. It had such a strong start in 2020, but it has really faded completely away from the top 100 here in 2024. And I assume that it too has that same situation of landfall is very, very crowded, and people have found a lot of interesting things to do in that particular territory.
Yeah, and somehow a commander that started out as not really having a very crowded field, Osgir the Reconstructor was kind of the first really quality Boros commander that wasn't just absolutely shoehorned into an equipment theme. So it was really nice for players to finally have a departure from that. And then the crowded field kind of came along later when we started getting other actually interesting Boros commanders that weren't doing just that one thing. We've still gotten Boros equipment commanders since then, but we at least have had enough of a variety that it kind of took a lot of pressure off Osgir the Reconstructor, where it didn't have to carry all of the weight of being the only kind of Boros commander that didn't snooze people away because it did that only one thing.
Hey, now, there was Feather the Redeemed too. Feather is cool, but I love what you pointed out about Osgir as this is possibly one of the most heartening figures to see in all of the data is Osgir specifically, because it was carrying so much weight for what was expected of the red-white color combo.
Yeah, it really was.
And clearly it falling off in terms of being in the top 100, I think is a sign of the great direction that Boros has been able to go since it first came out in 2021. So I love seeing that particular stripe for Osgir fading away. Osgir no longer bears that burden, and that's such a relief to see.
Well, that sometimes is a thing that makes a commander fade away, but like as we talked about previously, it didn't really hurt Marin that much when we got a Muldrotha. So like sometimes the newer, hotter thing replaces something, and sometimes it just doesn't. And what the factors are that make it so it works that way, we're not really sure, but that's just the way it goes sometimes.
For sure.
So the next category we have here are like social reputational problems, commanders that gave you some maybe negative reason to stop playing them. And for me, the one that jumps out here, because this is the commander we've complained about for years, is Chulane, Teller of Tales. And it doesn't create bad play patterns necessarily, but I think in a lot of situations, this was a commander where people just felt like when you were winning a game with Chulane, it was because Chulane did all of the heavy lifting for you. And I think, like, realistically, people like to win games, but like I think they also like to feel like they were involved in that process. And I think Chulane makes it feel like the commander did it and you really didn't necessarily do any of that heavy lifting.
Yeah, Chulane was just such a bane on the format for so long. It came out same time that Korvold the Fakehurst King came around, but Korvold obviously had a little more staying power, as we mentioned earlier. So Chulane almost could have gone into the crowded field too, because if there's anything that Wizards of the Coast loves designing more than a really powerful Simic commander, it's really powerful Bant commanders.
Yeah.
So there has been a little bit more competition. We've gotten stuff like Mrs. Bumbleflower lately that also is just a wickedly powerful Bant commander. But Chulane, absolutely, I would wager there was some amount of tired factor leading to Chulane kind of tailing off. But It's been a couple years since Chulane was in the top 100 commanders, which is kind of obscene to think about when, if you were playing back when Chulane was first printed, you thought you were never going to see the end of Chulane.
Right. And now it's only the 6th most popular banned commander, which kind of, thank goodness. Yeah, it does seem like people really recognized the obnoxiousness that commander is capable of. But what's especially impressive to me is that we actually can see Chulane got a reprint in 2024, and that didn't push it back into the top 100. So it does really seem like the door has officially closed on that one. And
one of the complaints we made about Chulane was we felt like no matter what you were doing in those colors, Chulane did the job better than anything else you would be running. And frankly, that's probably still true. And that's probably the reason people got sick of seeing it and playing it.
Well, I also think there's a little bit of a factor of, we talked about CEDH, how the most powerful commanders, most powerful combinations are kind of pushed in that. I think for Chulane and also Veyron, Voice of Duality, which is another commander that we see really kind of died out over time, those two commanders, they're not quite powerful enough for CEDH to kind of exist in that space, but they're also a little too powerful for the more social pods. And so they're kind of commanders without a home, where Chulane is just giving you all the value and playing one way. And then, Veyron, Voice of Duality, just, do you want a spellcast trigger? You're going to get 17 of them. And so it was such a fast deck, but fragile, so it couldn't really hang in CDH circles.
Yeah, and it also got a reprint as well, and that also has not affected its numbers, same that we saw for Chulane.
Yeah.
I have to imagine that the Izzet Spellslinger is a particularly competitive field as well.
Probably. Yeah.
Like the reprint there, I want to say was OTJ in the Stella Lee precon.
I believe so.
And Stella Lee is yet another combo engine. So for all we know, we might see her have similar figures in the same way that Veyron did, fading over time because people see this cool combo that it can do. And then eventually, as with the rest of this category, the luster of that does start to fade in terms of how it is socially received, as you were saying. And also in terms of the deck seems to be playing itself for you is another thing that can sometimes cause people to lose interest in their own decks too.
And I think these commanders also often have that play pattern we talked about earlier, where you feel like either you can't let the person play and you have to remove their commander all the time, or you're going to lose. And that's sometimes no fun to be the person who's casting that commander and knows that it's going to be instantly removed.
Yeah. Well, and so there is one more subcategory here too that I think we got to give special consideration to. This actually probably could have been category B, because B for banned, which is Golos. I don't know if we would have ever seen the end of that Pilgrim, because holy cow, that had a death grip on what it was doing to the format. I don't think Golos, and looking back as far as we can, ever left the top 10 as far as most built commanders in its entire lifetime, up until it was banned in late 2021.
It literally did not. We can see here it was rank 3, then 1, then 1, then 1, then 1, then 2, then 1. There was a brief moment where it was
1 month at 10.
Yeah, 1 month as the 10th most popular commander. And it's so funny to see this particular drop off really is a cliff's edge, because it is a hard stop at the end of 2021, of course, when it was banned. So Golos, you get a very unique category. But I look over those numbers and I'm like, you know what? Well, at the moment of Golos's banning, I remember being very, very surprised at that. I was like, oh, what, really? These numbers do confirm that, the reason that one got banned, we can literally see in the numbers just how omnipresent it truly was. And we can even still see how popular Kenrith, which is sort of the Golos replacement, still is. We saw that on another graph. So these 5-color commanders that can sit atop so many varied strategies and do it so well. There's a lot to learn from this particular instance of Golos being banned right there for being just so crazy ubiquitous.
Yeah, there's a lot of hunger for just 5-color good stuff. And we see that with a lot of commanders at all levels of play, whether it was the Golos, whether it was Kenrith. We talked about Joe to the Unifier. There's always going to be some sort of 5-color commander that's just going to lend itself to a lot of people liking it, because you don't want to have any restrictions. And that's just kind of what the problem was with Golos.
Yeah. In retrospect, Golos's ban shouldn't have been a surprise to me when I'm looking over these numbers.
Right. No, absolutely not.
So the last kind of weird non-category we have here is a couple of commanders that didn't quite make the cut. And Matt, you want to explain those to us?
Yeah, so when we constructed the reports that we're looking at and set up those specific parameters, there are a couple commanders that kind of faded in and out, but I really wanted to make sure we gave special mention to Calamax and Elsha of the Infinite that, again, I felt like these were never going to go away with how popular they were. Calamax especially, because that was such a combo-friendly commander. I don't know if I remember watching Josh Lee Kwai play this deck, and oh my gosh, it just looked unstoppable. I thought it was going to be omnipresent forever, and it did stick around for a while. But man, these two commanders especially, once people kind of got sick of them, they've not been resurrected at all.
Yeah, these ones seem to sort of sputter out compared to the other ones that we were just looking at, of like falling out, trying to get back in, and then eventually falling out, trying to get back in. So depending on how precisely we wanted to tweak those parameters, technically, I think those are definitely worth mentioning because, yeah, Elsha was extraordinarily popular as a Jeskai commander. And that does seem to be a play pattern that maybe people have wearied of perhaps a little bit, or they found other Jeskai things doing just as gross Jeskai things, perhaps in a more efficient way. These commanders are capable of doing some extraordinary combo territory stuff, and it's hard to say whether they were outclassed or whether people grew tired of them.
Well, these days, I think they found Jeskai commanders doing energy things,
Sure.
As the pre-constructed decks we got this year have any sort of hint towards.
And plenty of development has happened in Temur as well to oust Calamax too. So yeah.
And the reality is for a lot of the stuff, it's probably a combination of all of those things at the same time.
Yeah. So Dana, we have one more question that we really wanted to get digging into here. Why don't you take us into this before we wrap up this exceedingly long episode that we have here going?
So the last thing we have are commanders that are just hanging in there. And we define this as commanders that were released before January 1st, 2024. They didn't fade out or have a comeback. And starting 3 months after their peak, they've been between ranks 40 and 100 over 50% of the time. And in the last year, they have an average rank between 45 and 75.
Yeah, so these commanders didn't fade out, but they might. These are not the strong contenders, the big staying power titans of the format that we saw earlier, but they're also not the ones that have been eventually weaning off and that energy has really seemed to go to other commanders. These are commanders that are kind of question marks about their future. It's tough to say whether they will remain in the top 100 as time goes on, or whether they eventually might be kind of budged out of that particular territory. So how do we think the commanders on this graph break down? What groupings stand out?
I think the first category that we really want to get into is, again, that niche or repetitive nature of what the commander is doing. And we're talking about commanders like Animar, Soul of the Elements, which is you cast like 4 creatures and you get an Eldrazi. Gets out of hand really fast. Or Niv Mizzet Perrin is another one that's just a combo-centric commander that does one thing extremely well, but the play patterns can definitely be repetitive from game to game.
Yeah, these are commanders that have that one specific thing. They maybe don't get enough toys to keep the deck fresh, but the drought isn't quite as severe as it is elsewhere.
Yeah.
Rin and Siri, for example, deck that cares about cats and dogs. We don't get a ton of cats and dogs enough to constantly keep you with an influx of new exciting cards for that deck, but we get a cat every set and a dog every set usually, and you're going to get occasionally a few things. So it's much more of a slow trickle with a lot of these that it keeps people from just entirely dropping them because there's something new to keep you interested a little bit.
Yeah, Rin and Sari's heat map, it fluctuates a lot. It came out of the gates real hot. It was one of the most popular commanders for a little bit there.
Yep.
Then it kind of sunk down a little bit and then rose back up, and it really just kind of had seasonality to it.
Yeah.
Because like Dana said, you'd have a few cats in one set, then you have a few dogs in another set. And so it really gave you just enough interest to hold on and keep updating that deck and keep it together. So yeah, kudos to Rin and Sari for just having some sort of longevity to it when it's not like a marquee, hyper powerful deck. It's just, there's a lot of fun. I mean, if you don't like cats and dogs, who are you?
I was going to make that same comment about the fluctuation here. It almost like this commander has a pulse of, we get to see it ride those waves.
Yeah, 100%.
Up and down with various. You can detect here at the beginning of 2024, clearly we got an injection of the secret layer Rin and Sari deck that also people were able to get access to. And so we're able to see certain peaks. They're not huge peaks, but they are a little bit more, and then it'll ride down again. But it is certainly not leaving the top 100. But over enough time, it's possible that some of these commanders could. Rin and Sari we noticed as being a little bit niche, but some of these commanders also feel that same thing that Dana, you were talking about, of being a little bit repetitive in the type of gameplay that they produce, which I think definitely will go for Go Shintai of Life's Origin, possibly one of the most interesting for us to discuss on this graph. That's the Shrines commander, and it was so cool for people to have a place to put Shrines. And clearly, since it's the de facto thing to do for a Shrines deck, anyone who's ever interested in that strategy will basically always go towards Go Shintai. But at least speaking anecdotally with people I know who have a Go Shintai deck, there's also a piece of them that kind of is a little bit bummed that like that is the only de facto shrine commander in a way. And so that makes their interest with this very tenuous, and I think that's reflected in what we're seeing on this chart.
Yes, I mean, sometimes even just having a second commander that does a thing just helps bring more light to it. Like we kind of saw with the actual like good and playable Eldrazi commanders. You had Ulalek, which was the marquee one, but there's enough around it that it drives interest back to it. Whereas Go Shintai, that's the only thing that's going to be standing there. And so there's really not a whole lot to keep that interest coming back either.
Or like with Pantlaza, we saw earlier, drove a lot more interest towards dinosaurs. Towards dinosaurs as a contrast to Gishath. And that gave a whole bunch of new life to that particular creature type. Go Shintai doesn't necessarily have that competition. Yeah.
Sometimes having another commander, like a secondary commander beyond the de facto one, helps drive interest up.
Well, and that's a pretty good segue here to category B, which are commanders that have probably gotten ousted by another commander that does something really, really similar or similar enough that people have either stopped building this commander deck so they can build this secondary competitive commander, or they've just switched their deck over to this new one.
Yeah, having more similar commanders can sometimes drive interest up. A rising tide raises all ships. But sometimes new commanders can divide the audience and zap the focus away from those mainstays. Examples of that here are commanders like Vile Smasher and Crown, partners that are well known for being CEDH leaders, but not always the top dogs of the meta. So they hover around the bottom half of the top 100 commanders each month, like in the 70th and 80th range, but they haven't fallen out of the top 100 completely. Or Atla Palani and Henzi Toolbox Story are another more casual example we're seeing on these charts here, and those have each been penduluming from about the 20th place range down to the 50th place range, and then some years later up to the 30th place range to the 60th place, all throughout the years that they've been around, kind of bouncing back and forth within that range in that area. You know, each of those are both enjoyable big creature beats decks, which is a fan favorite archetype to be sure, but that is a big archetype, a big area that we continue to keep seeing new legendary designs cater to, which means that staying the number one king of the hill in that area is hard to sustain for many years in a row. And that's why we're seeing the numbers here for those commanders as we do. And I want to make sure that we clarify one more time that, again, many of these are still very, very popular, often like the third or fourth place most popular commander of their respective color combinations. Like we said, these are the commanders that are still hanging in there. They are staying in the top 100, and staying in the top 100 is indeed a feat. They're just not maintaining the same top dominance they once had. They are past their peak popularity. So there is a chance they could maintain their positions or rise or potentially fall down to the 5th or 6th places or lower as time goes on.
Yeah, when looking at the heat map, like the lows keep getting lower and lower every time they come, and the highs are getting lower and lower. Like every time there's a little bit of a pulse, it's like it's slowly fading down.
Yeah.
Like that really is like a life cycle almost. Like you get to follow the ebbs and flows of a lot of these charts. I think Brea Ethereum Shaper is also another really good example of this, where it's not gone, but it's right around the outskirts of staying relevant in the top 100 consistently.
Yeah, Brea's chart especially has, again, a lot of those waves that seem to really respond to particular artifact moments, or even just her own reprints seem to be what is sort of surging her back into relevance. So she's not fallen out of the top 100, but given enough time, it's hard to say exactly what her future holds, especially as so many other artifact commanders and powerful commanders as well keep coming back to the forefront. She strikes me as potentially another maybe CEDH related commander here too. Not a format I'm necessarily proficient in, but I could see her coming in and out of vogue, so to speak, in competitive play is possibly another answer here. But like, yeah, an artifact deck that does combo stuff or powerful stuff the way that Brea can do, you've got fierce competition, and she's usually top dog, but that doesn't mean she's always top dog.
This one to me is the really fascinating one, because you get to kind of see these older commanders that get to pop up a little bit, because what caused this? Was it a reprint like we saw with Vile Smasher kind of got reinvigorated with getting a reprint, same with Brea. But then these other ones are just kind of, you see a set that came out. Oh, the Teysa Karlov got a little bit of support, specifically in getting more death triggers, for example. And so it gets a little bit of a rise and it slows down a little bit, and then it gets a little bit of a rise. And trying to track that on these heat maps is really, really fascinating thought experiment to do.
For Teysa Karlov, that bump in February 2023, that was Phyrexia Albi 1, and we got a couple of those big mythic black and white creatures that also care about death triggers. Drivnod, and I forget what the other one was.
Oh, Mondrak, Glory Dominus.
Mondrak.
Yeah, there were a handful of things that definitely made Teysa get all that punchier. So it is interesting to see the deck data respond to all of her new toys that she got.
Well, and I love that it's not even stuff that's directly related. Just, oh my gosh, Teysa still is really good for this type of archetype, and just jumps it back in. And it's funny that, we pointed out with some of these commanders, the reprint drives them coming back into the public eye. Teysa got popular and then got reprinted a couple months later and then started to decline. So it's kind of funny seeing that the reprint is actually the beginning of the next dip for Teysa Karlov.
There's probably a lot of folks that cracked open that Drivnod and I want to build that deck, and then started doing a search for things that do something similar and found Teysa and I'll just build a Teysa deck and put Drivnod in that deck.
Yeah, sort of some cool set energy going there that made her get that bump in popularity before she even got the reprint, but then that doesn't necessarily sustain itself is very interesting. And I never would have suspected that Teysa Karlov would be a commander for whom that is a possibility. Another one that is interesting here, since we mentioned earlier Go Shintai, I think it's important for us to point out the decline or struggling popularity of Sisei Weatherlight Captain as well, which is the 5-color Sisei option. That one was a de facto Shrine commander for a while until Go Shintai came around and really gave it a run for its money, which has forced Sisei Weatherlight Captain to try and find kind of a new home, so to speak. And I think there's just this great big drop off there in 2022 where we can see, she's got some true competition. And since then, she's been struggling to maintain where her identity is when she wants to do some interesting stuff with fun legends. And she's competing with Go Shintai. And frankly, actually, now that I say it out loud, also Joda, the unifier, came out too, to give her an even bigger run for her money. So she's really struggling to find her proper home still.
Well, and this one, I don't know if it's proper home, because we know the home for Sisei Weatherlight Captain. We know what that is with all the Legends Matters. Just we've gotten so much more competition, whether it's Joda, whether it's any of the generic 5-color commanders too, like Kenrith Return King, once again comes back into the conversation. So Sisei, the card is still powerful for sure, but we're just, again, there's so much more competition. And then especially when we've gotten in the past couple years too, Historic Matters themes, which are getting a little more specific in their colors.
Yeah.
Like in the Assassin's Creed set, it was Mardu colors that were doing a lot of that Historic Matters. So they're encompassing a lot of the legendary synergies in there too.
And with something like Sisei, there's probably also at least some percentage of the players who are like, I just don't like having to tutor every turn.
Honestly, yeah.
Yeah.
That can be a frustrating play pattern, and that might have caused, so there's some percentage of the people that played it who abandoned that deck for that reason.
Or who were drawn to that deck in the first place for that reason.
Sure.
But then,
and then got sick of it or whatever,
Well,
It wasn't people with small hands having to shuffle their decks all the time, though. That's for sure.
Yeah, I can see it being the kind of thing that draws a lot of interest for that reason and then eventually wanes a lot of interest for that same reason. That's so funny. Well, and so those were our first two categories of why these commanders might be struggling to maintain or seem to potentially be in the process of fading out of the top 100. Potentially, they haven't quite yet. But there's also a third category of them here that, Matt, I recall you laughing when I put this word into the show notes when you saw what I wrote as maybe a reason why or a thing that they might have in common.
It was one of those moments where you and I are just perfectly in sync and you took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah, this last category we'd use to parse through all the data on this chart are the commanders that are infamous. Known quantities that are nearly impossible to play politely. There's some really big names in this category, actually. But as a quick teaser, some examples that we're seeing here are ones like Ariet of the Charmed Apple, an Orzhov Enchantments commander that'll drain life from your opponents. Commanders where it's hard to hide your intentions, or it's hard to pretend you're not the problem, because you probably are the problem. In many cases, these are still commanders that are among the top of their color combos, but within the peer group of the top 100, we see that they've stuck around lower on the ladder, often around the 70s or 80s range. And specifically, what's unifying this last grouping, this last category of the way we're interpreting the data here is the experience that these commanders can create in their play patterns. It's not that they're miserable to play against in the ways that, a Tox roll can be miserable, but we do all know what these commanders are up to and how good they are at that job. And there's a sense of these commanders feeling a little bit solved in some ways that keeps them right at that Venn diagrammatical intersection between being exciting to build, but also often creating some very similar experiences in every game they play.
Stuff like Urza, Lord High Artificer, where you kind of know what's coming. You see the Urza, you're like, oh my gosh, what kind of game is this going to be? And you have to make accommodations after that. Or Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth, where, oh my gosh, this is just going to power through the table. So there's a lot of different commanders where I'm not really surprised that people are kind of fading away at the non-CEDH level tables from stuff like Kirik and Urza especially.
And as we mentioned, it's maybe not fun for you as the pilot to have your, because no one's letting Urza sit around. right? Like that commander is being removed as soon as possible. And not only do you maybe get that response from your opponents and you get tired of hearing it, you as a person probably gets tired of your commander being removed as soon as it hits the table. Like that, there's just multiple axes in which a lot of these commanders can create unfun play patterns.
When you talked about not being fun to play yourself, Atraxa Grand Unifier, I've seen a couple of those at any given event that we've been at lately. And it does take a significant amount of time to resolve. Anytime you have a flicker effect, you have to go through just a huge amount of decisions. It's kind of like I had my Tom Bombadil deck that was all about sagas. I don't like playing that deck a ton, especially at events, because the amount of time invested every single turn to go through all those different decisions, that's kind of the same thing with the Grand Unifier. You have to make so many decisions every time you flicker your Atraxa that it just slows the game down. I'm not surprised to see people kind of souring on that version of Atraxa.
In particular, there's something reputational that's happening with this final category.
Yeah.
Urza's ridiculously good, but the reputation precedes him. So you really do have to be very prepared with a particular type of Urza list if you're going to make the waves that you want to make. And that is also true, as you mentioned, of Keurig as well. Their reputation precedes them. They are known to have certain effects on that game board. So if you are going to build them, you kind of can't do it innocently. You do have to be very prepared for a very particular type of probably archenemy experience. And it can be difficult to withstand that much pressure, especially when there are so many other commanders that are also doing extremely powerful things. And if you're planting a flag as, I'm probably going to be the archenemy right off the bat, that can make those games a little bit more difficult sometimes, depending on whether or not you're actually properly prepared for them. And that strain, I think, is something that we can kind of see emerging in these fluctuating numbers for all of these commanders too.
Yeah, I mean, these are commanders that, like, when you reveal them, you can audibly hear people's eyes roll sometimes. And like that's discouraging to play sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about commanders that just everybody's eyes roll, we haven't got a chance to talk about Turgid, God of Fright. Turgid doesn't show up on these numbers in these reports because Turgid's never been quite popular enough. But yeah, absolutely. It's that same phenomenon where these commanders very high on the salt list when you look at EDHREC's numbers there for a very good reason. There's just a lot of social interaction that goes around these. And I think I want to say that that's playing a significant part in these too, is just because people want to have fun with their decks. And a lot of times if your friends aren't having fun, then you're not going to have fun by default.
Yeah.
It's so funny that you mentioned Turgid because I know you got a vendetta against that one.
Yeah.
But to be honest, Turgid is actually a commander I'm surprised not to have seen in any of these like fade away charts or anything that we've made here. I'm actually surprised at its absence among some of this data.
So I was actually talking with Julia as we were putting these reports together, because she and I, we kind of brainstormed a lot of these back end pieces and refined Joey's questions as we were building this episode out. So Turgid never got high enough. So Turgid right now is number 97, and that's the mono black commander that when you make your opponents discard or do anything, you get all their stuff, and it's the most miserable experience of all time. That is the Oracle text. I'm not making that part up. So Turgid never got really too high to be included in the commanders that we talked about earlier, whether it's commanders that had staying power, because it was always so low. Turgid is actually, I would say, a fantastic way to narrate the social impact that comes along with picking your commander, because Turgid been lingering in and out of the top 100 at any given month. But right now, in the past 2 years, Turgid's number 97. So yes, definitely a reputation that's more befitting of a commander you'd think that was in the top 10.
Yeah. I guess it couldn't have fallen into any of these because it didn't necessarily fade away. It was only ever like maybe 101st for most of those months.
Yeah.
So it never had the opportunity to see some of these, for instance, drop-offs or big fluctuations that we see, because it, like so many other commanders, was just out on on those outskirts of the top 100. I mean, heck, there are so many other commanders that didn't make it in here too. But you know what, Matt, I'm glad to see that you did not have to talk about Turgid this episode, except for the fact that we made you.
Except for the fact that I had to explain why we didn't talk about Turgid.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, there's a lot of just interesting things that we learned along this process. And I'm sure that, once we hear from all you listeners out there with some more questions about the data, we might have more answers that we can dig up and kind of see, because we have a ton of data, and it's so fascinating to see kind of what kind of turns up in the course of digging into it.
This was one of the more ambitious projects we've done, but dang, am I happy that we did. This is a big bite. This is telling a really big story of Commander over the past 4 years, 5 years almost. Like, there's so much fluctuation that's happened, and you can really trace particular moments. And honestly, looking through some of this data really jogged quite a lot of memories of the day that I felt when that thing was banned, or how excited I got when a commander I like got new toys, and then everyone else got excited too. And we can see those numbers pumping back up and stuff like that. This is showing, I mean, I know it's only like, a 4.5 year span or something like that, but it's showing me like moments that I feel like a little nostalgic about too, So like, this has been so delightful to look over. I'm kind of curious what everyone's favorite one was. Listeners, you got to let us know which of these charts was the one that spoke to you the most.
Yeah, it's so much fun kind of seeing like our history, because the three of us, Dana, you and I have been playing for however long, before Joy was born, like 13 years ago. but it's so fun. I love getting to dig into this because, yeah, Joey, like you said, we see our feelings portrayed in the data. You see a reprint, or you see a set come out that supports an old forgotten commander, and so it reinvigorates, and we're on that, and it's so cool to see it displayed in a visual way. And I want to thank Julia so much for her help getting these visualizations together, because all of this would have been completely overwhelming without it.
For sure. And Matt, there's a surprise heat map that I made for you here. Just a really quick one. And it's interesting. This one super does not fade. It is actually a heat map of the intensity of your hatred towards Turgid. And it's just number one solid green the whole way through.
That heat map actually, burning fire, annihilation, whatever those cards are that just talk about like burning, that absolutely applies. So yes, good call there.
Cool. Well, guys, I think we are now at long last finally going to wrap up this beast of an episode. Listeners, once again, get in touch with us and let us know your thoughts about looking over all of this history of Commander. Which commanders are of the most interest to you? The commanders that had those small flash in the pan moments, the commanders that faded, or the commanders that have stayed strong this whole time? What resonates with you most here? On that note, though, guys, we are going to call this episode to a close. So if our listeners would like to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find us on the onlines? Matt, let's start with you.
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, if you want some of the best ways to protect your cards, check out Dragon Shield. They've got the best play mats, card sleeves, everything out there. Just make sure to check them out, because boy, go into the lair. You're not going to suffer any dragon fire there.
And Dana?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. You can find all of us at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And remember, if you're looking to pick up cards that you need by trading cards you don't need, use cardsphere.com.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online at the handle Joseph M. Schultz. Plus, you can find the cast online at EDHRECast. And if you got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, thanks for sticking with us. We'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until next time, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.